Thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to read to you from the beginning of my book, Your Art Will Save Your Life, and it sort of contextualizes the work I do in the world and how I came to do it. Dear artist, you are holding my love letter to artists. Artists are the most important people in my life, and I need you to stay active and creatively engaged through this and all political shifts. Your art will help you navigate the world, and it will light the way for others. I have dedicated my professional and volunteer life to artists, especially those who are marginalized in the dominant art worlds. Women, queer and trans artists, artists of color, low-income artists, emerging artists, dropouts, artists who never sell anything, and brilliant weirdos who make work that defies commercial understanding. I want artists to reflect the world back to me, interpret it, and create new worlds for me to imagine. After the 2016 presidential election, many of my artist clients said things like, maybe I should quit making art. It's kind of selfish for me to focus on my art now, and I should help people in a more effective way. These are expected grief responses to the shock and horror of our times, but I beseech you, do not stop making art. I need it profoundly. We all do. Anytime you feel overwhelmed by humanity's impact on people, animals, and the planet, or really anytime you think you can't leave the house because the world is too hard, I want you to think about the art, performances, music, books, and films that have made you want to be alive. Think about how those artists, like you, probably felt overwhelmed by their lives and the times they were living in, but they made the thing anyway. Your future audiences need your work, so you need to make it. I focus on history for perspective. This helps me take strategic next steps. I read about artists making work during war, in times of violence, and despite systemic neglect. For example, I like to look to artists living during the AIDS pandemic. I read a lot about the role artists and activists played in changing science, research, policy, and culture. The AIDS movement was largely orchestrated by artists and activists, many of whom were young and watching their friends die. Today, we are in a different time and place. Depending on who you are, the Trump administration may not impact you drastically, or you may encounter devastating, life-changing experiences. We don't know what will happen, but historically, under oppressive regimes and fascist governments, it is the brave and creative ones who lead, who solve problems, and who incite, inspire, organize, comfort, satirize, and reflect. You are not alone. You have what you need for your life, for art, and for justice. Stay with your creative path, trust your vision, and know that your contributions will matter to someone else. XO, Gossip Girl. I really wanted to end the opening letter that way, and I don't think Feminist Press was into it. That's a little bit of a dated reference since that show's not on the air anymore. I'm going to read you a little bit from the opening essay that goes, "You're an artist, keep making art." The realization that art could first save and then expand my life came when I was a teenager in a troubled home. Life with my mentally ill mom and alcoholic dad near Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, before the internet was difficult. A smart, queer feminist without the language to talk about any of it, let alone identify with those lineages, I was profoundly depressed and mostly miserable. I ached for art and counterculture, but they were really hard to come by in small Rust Belt towns in the 90s. I read books, made zines, bought 45s, and ordered Sub Pop record catalogs out of the back of Spin magazine, which at the time was a wonderland filled with mysterious ads for things like the Anarchist Cookbook. Then in 1994, the Andy Warhol Museum opened in downtown Pittsburgh. I was 15 and fortunate to be present for the museum's midnight opening thanks to my neighbor Carol, an artist and public school art teacher who saw in me a deep need for connection to something beyond what was available in my sad town and busted school. Something new was born in me that night as I wandered the museum from top to bottom, looking at Warhol's iconic and more obscure works, obsessively combing through the gift shop, gawking at the drag queens and kindred freaks clamoring to explore this unfathomable building. That museum opening uncovered an intuition stifled by my surroundings. There would be places I belonged, and there were communities I must find. Back then, I could barely understand, let alone articulate, what was so important to me about the museum, but now I know it clearly. It was a history and lineage of queer art. Andy Warhol made an exciting life for himself despite his impoverished Pittsburgh upbringing. I saw color and humor and possibilities for a better future. I saw strange people who made their own world, and it looked wild and limitless. I saw political discourse and tongue-in-cheek paintings, sculptures, and drawings. The factory, music, art, women, style, humor, sex, and outrageous drugs. I just had to turn 18 and move away. That became reason enough to live through my remaining years in high school. It's been more than 20 years since that night at the Andy Warhol Museum, and since then I have consistently, heavily relied on artists to make me want to be in the world at its worst and embody a deeper experience of life at its best. I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. So that opening letter referenced the 2016 election period.
Does everyone remember that?
And later on, you talked quite a bit about how it really traumatized many of us. Mm-hmm. And particularly artists, you saw them get into this fixed state of responding to what I call the orange menace, as like their asshole stepfather, mm-hmm. and being traumatized, right? And that the way to do that was to, wherever you are, emotionally or politically, socially, do your art, mm-hmm. right? So give us a few examples, some people you see doing the dang thing despite or because. Mm-hmm. Because I think we need that inspiration.
Yeah. I think it was a really prevalent, I'm sure you experienced this in the Bay Area, in LA where I am, surrounded by a ton of artist communities. In the immediacy after the election, it was a really normal response for a ton of people to think, well, I have to change my life and do something different, no matter what I'm already doing. And I am very much of the belief that you just start wherever you are. Wherever you are is exactly where you're supposed to be, and that we all have something to contribute to whatever justice seeking we're after, right where we are. We don't have to wait, we don't have to become different people. And in fact, artists are going to sustain life for so many people. And you don't always necessarily know or believe that. But artists, no matter the work that they're making, when they make the work and let it be out in the world, it's going to have a transformative impact on someone. You have no control over who and when that will happen, but probably everyone in this room has been on the receiving end of that at some point in their life. You can point to different things throughout your life that sort of made you want to continue or transformed your thinking or made you feel connected to yourself and other people, right? And I could see very clearly, no, we're really going to need that right now. People are in crisis. This is really scary. Everyone's enraged and exhausted. We're going to need artists more than ever, no matter the content of the work. And so when I think about what I've seen in LA that I am most impressed by, that is in terms of how it serves me, one example is a friend who does a monthly performance night called Weirdo Night. Her name's Jibs Cameron. Her performance persona is Dynasty Handbag. And once a month, she creates this performance where there's like 3 to 5 different performers, some local, some visiting, that just do weird, absurd, really funny, politically driven performance. So it's like we all have this cathartic experience of rage and laughing for an evening, a group of just weird people together in their room. And every month I see the same people going there, and I get to see these incredible performances. And what I found is it facilitates feelings for me. As a Capricorn, it's really hard to have feelings. I need art to help me feel feelings. That's one of its roles for me. And I've noticed every month going to this performance night, you know, whatever's going on in my life, maybe I'd be crying about it before the show once I'm in that space with all of these people. So suddenly it would allow me to feel my feelings. And feeling feelings is sort of what helps us then get to the other side of moving into action. So that's just an example of something that I see this artist being very generous in creating a space every month for people to come, a platform for other performers to perform, and for everybody to laugh and feel rage at the same time.
Wow, that's really cool. To me, that's connected in some ways to something you mentioned later on in the book around your tips. Mm-hmm. And one of the pieces of advice you give people is to have a conversation with yourself, so to speak, and ask yourself the question, do I want my art to be political? Mm-hmm. Right? For some of us, it's never been a question. It was like, of course I want my art to be political. Mm-hmm. I'm an activist. I come out of community organizing. Of course it's going to be at some level. For others, they make a clean line. They draw a clean border between their politics and their art, right? And for some others, they leave it ambiguous. Mm-hmm. So when people start digging into that question, what comes up And what's your advice about how to deal with that? Because I'm sure people who are dealing with, like, in this age of the Orange Menace, I think I need to be political, but maybe not. So what happens when people start digging into that question?
Yeah.
Should my art be political?
It's a really good question, and I hear it from artists a lot, especially after the election, but I heard it from people before then. And I think the first thing I go to with my clients is to ask them, what is your vision for what you want to make? The first thing is, can you come back to the truth inside of you of what you want to make? That is the guiding principle to follow. And I would tell people, this is what I wrote in the book, if you want to make overtly political work, do it. And if you don't, that's okay too. That first and foremost, you have to make the work that is inside of you that needs to come out. And my clients are all women, queers, and people of color. No matter what they're making, whether abstract or overt, clear messaging or something really nebulous or really conceptually driven, they are politicized bodies in culture. There's no choice over whether their work is contextualized in that way. So I was meeting with a client earlier today who's a queer woman of color, and she's like, well, my work's not really overtly queer. And I was like, it doesn't matter because you are queer, so anything you make is part of this lineage. And you have, even when a person makes something that they believe has a really overt message, you have no control over how the audience is experiencing it, right? Once you make the work and let it be in the world, that's where the artist's control sort of ends, because you can't force, you can't facilitate a viewer or an audience member to experience what you intended. You have to sort of pass it over to them. So really overt political work might not resonate with a person, and they might not get the message you're looking for. And so whatever your intentions are, they're sort of separate from what the audience might be experiencing. So I always tell a person, a client, when you're curious, like, what should you be making? Are you trying to live in an audience's head, in a viewer's head, or are you in yourself? And try to move it back to, what am I trying to make? What is going on inside of me that I'm trying to get outward?
Right. So tapping back into the passion that makes them want to do art in the first place, right? Which comes to the question of what happens when you're stuck with that question, right?
Of what do I want to make?
Yeah. Where's my passion right now?
Right.
And you also say, and I think you're exactly right, usually it's about time, money, or inspiration when people get to that place. And, one thing I want to pull out, you say the key lesson now is to accept that your anxieties about money in particular are separate from your need to make the art, right? To kind of separate. How does that work? And, like, how does that work particularly for the audience that you work with, right? We're in the structure that, the art world is about, it's an oppressive structure in many ways, right? It can be, where there's a wage gap, particularly around people of color and women and queer folk, right? When you look at who gets what amount of recognition and acclaim. So, especially dealing with money and inspiration, how do we begin to reconcile that? How can we begin to not let that stop us, but also, like, know that it's not just about money?
Yeah. Well, I think the theoretical underpinning of my practice is that artists are people who have to make work in order to be on the planet. That artists are creatively engaged because they need to be. It's a way they take care of themselves. It's a way they relate to themselves and other people. It's a thing that grounds them on the planet. And in my experience of working with artists, when they stop being creatively engaged, their life quality deteriorates. And that's different from non-artists. I, for example, don't have to make things in order to be well or feel connected. I have other parts of my life. I don't make art, right? But I rely on taking in a lot of art for those things. So the first thing I would do is sort of pull it out from anything else and just say, if you're an artist, I want you to accept that you are going to need to make art throughout the duration of your life, and move into acceptance of that that's a part of the package of how you care for yourself. And so no matter what's happening in your life, this is going to be a part of it. And a second thing is that you have to jealously guard some space to be creatively engaged. Because the world, all of it, your friends, your family, making money, movie pass, as I was talking about earlier, all of it wants to take you away from your practice, all of it. And it's up to the art, it's up to you to jealously guard some time and space to be creatively engaged and to protect it. If you do that, you will automatically be feel better than if you do not do those things. So that's sort of separate from the problem of capitalism, which is step 2, the problem of capitalism. How do we solve that? That's going to be my second book, Artists and the Problem of Capitalism. Now, I write about in here that it's really easy to believe I have to get this before I can make work, right? I have to have these conditions set up, which is a really easy way to then avoid making anything. It can be a trap of avoidance. And if there's something that requires money you don't have right now, move to a different project, is what I would say. For when somebody feels really stuck, that usually tells me they're in the woods with a project. They're in the hard part. Like the fun part, the easy part is the beginning, when you're in limerence with a new project. But when you're in the thick of it, you don't really know where it's going or if it's going, and it feels hard and you feel alone with it, and you're like, let's go watch a movie with my movie pass. That's when it's time to maybe invite other people in, other tactics, other resources, when it starts to feel hard. And if your brain starts telling you things like, well, I can't make this because of these reasons, time or money, which are the things I hear all the time. The time is up to the artist to jealously guard and protect. And money, you move on to the next thing. If you don't have money to do a key aspect of a project, I would tell the person to move on to another project in the meantime. And to take the pressure off of whatever it is that you're making. That it's more important to keep in the habit of studio practice or writing time, however you sort of orchestrate your creative time and space, that the habit is so much more important than anything else and will get you further. And when you're in the midst of a project, who knows if it's going to be a thing or not? It might be transporting you somewhere. It might be leading you to where you're supposed to get next. And you can't know that yet when you're in it, because you can't zoom out and see how it's all working. So at the end of the day, the simple thing is, if you're an artist, you have to maintain your practice and accept that that's something you're going to need to do for the rest of your life, separate from all the other problems of a modern life.
Yeah. So let's deal with that capitalist structure. Let's deal with that capitalist structure a little bit, because it's real. And part of doing our art, especially once we want to put it out in the world, like once we take it out of the studio or wherever, its creation, is dealing with all of those structures, dealing with a curator or an agent, or trying to get into some art institution, or writing the grant, right? All of those mechanisms that you have to deal with to have the art in the world. And even if it's on the scale of we're gonna have it in a church basement, you still got to deal with the church,
right?
Right?
Yeah.
How do we begin to be intentional about in those interactions, even if it's incremental, making some changes, right? We both written grants. You've written way more than I have, and we know that the language of grant writing is important, right? And that changes and will continue to change. Right now, the arts is for the moment fixated on equity. So a lot of grants are going to talk about how this is equitable or puts forth, but it's also a moment to teach them something as you're writing that grant, right? About why this is important to this community, and not just me as an artist, and not just the art world, right? So I'm wondering, when we're engaged, even if it's with our cadre of other artists that we call family, and we're inspiring each other to do our art instead of being stuck or afraid in this age of 45, you have thoughts around how do we move that dime a little bit around these issues that we care about? How do we make a little bit more access for the next artist who wants to use that church basement? Because you've taught that church a little bit something about trans people or whatever, right? Thoughts around that?
Yeah. I think artists' biggest resource that they have immediate access to is community. And I will often focus on, when I have a new client, the first thing I'm sort of assessing for them, assessing about their lives, is whether they have these sort of 3 conditions that I think are crucial, whether they're in balance. One is making art? Are they in a creative practice? Are they creating a space and protecting it to be in a creative practice? They have to make art. That's the first thing. The second is they need a community of artists who also want to make art, who wants good things for themselves and each other. That community is crucial. And then the third thing to be in balance is, are you taking in art? That an artist has to take in work. Things they like, things they hate, new things, old things, all kinds of work, sort of to have that outside stimulation. So I first sort of assess for those three things, are they in balance, are they happening? If not, and often one or more is off and sort of malnourished, we bring it back up. And I really focus on community because that resource is what can solve the problems that any individual can't solve on their own. And nobody can do anything by themselves. But in capitalism, we learned that you're supposed to be able to. And that's a myth. No one does anything by themselves. It's just not accurate or true at all. There's always hidden labor, hidden collaborators, other people who made something possible. So rather than try to struggle on your own, when you ask for help from the artists in your community, your projects come into fruition much faster and you get things. And almost all of my clients are socialized to not ask for things, whether it's money, opportunities, letters of recommendation, anything from a gatekeeper. They feel very reluctant to ask for anything. And so a lot of what I'm doing with my clients is sort of teaching them to perform a persona that will ask for things, even if they don't believe they should or can or must, right? But I would say how we help one another is being in community steeped in generosity. That hyper competition, competitiveness, scarcity, and this false belief that there's not enough resources to go along and go around, that comes from capitalism. That comes from the systems of oppression we live in, that I think a lot of people in the Bay Area are really keyed into and understand. Those systems teach us to fight among ourselves and with one another over the illusion of scraps, when really there are plenty of resources for everyone held by the ruling class that we have to take and redistribute, right? And artists have the ability to do that in really magnificent and grand ways. And so I think I'm going all over the place with the different things you brought up in that question.
That's really helpful. Give us an example.
An example? I tell all of my clients to think about how they can stimulate generosity in their artist circles, so that if somebody gets something amazing, everybody around them is really happy for them and knows that that will only also shine on them. I think there's probably fans in the room of the podcast Call Your Girlfriend by Ann Friedman and Aminatou Sow. And those two feminists and media makers have this great concept called shine theory, which goes, if you don't shine, I don't shine. And then, so the opposite is, when you shine, my friend, my community, then I do too. That's good for all of us. And that transforming our arts communities into using that as a methodology really works. And I see artist circles in Los Angeles, where I live, where people are very generous with time and resources in an effort to amplify each other's work and careers, because they all want to sort of ascend in whatever that means to them together. And they realize nobody can do it alone. And when somebody gets something, to look behind you and see who can you pull behind you. And so sort of like if you have a mentor, are you mentoring somebody as well? That you are taking resources and giving resources constantly, this sort of like flow through a community in like a big circle. Mm-hmm. I know it sounds utopic, but I think it's a tactic that really works. And I think it helps artists be happier, have more serenity and not buy into the myth of scarcity and poverty, thinking that there's not enough to go around, because it's not true.
Yes, I agree. You mentioned, and it's related to this, I think, a few times in the book, the impact of the internet on the arts, right? And, people are using it to promote their art. They're using it for community engagement in their art. They're using it to have this conversation, and they use it for distraction, right? Mm-hmm.
And to hurt themselves.
Yeah.
For sure.
Talk about that for a minute.
Has anybody here hurt themselves with the internet today? Has anyone hurt themselves with social media? I mean, lots of different ways. Social media breeds compare and despair. We're looking at somebody's outsides and comparing them to our insides. And when we do that, we feel bad. That's a universal experience. And social media essentially is marketing. It's marketing. Even if it's a personal account, you're very carefully cultivating and crafting what is available. It's a marketing tool, a very useful one. And I want my clients to use social media, but not hurt themselves with it. Right? So some of my clients, depending on what's going on for them, like I've had clients who, especially before and after the election, were profoundly depressed. Of course, because the world felt like it was on fire. More so, the flames had been turned up. And so for some of my clients, my homework for them was to have just a break from social media for a period of time, just to see what it felt like, just to see if it felt better. Guess what? It feels better. Like I quit Facebook after the election. I was like, I need one thing to make me feel 2% better. And I quit Facebook, and that was a really good choice. And I've had clients where I have them block all social media, actually use technology to block other technologies from all of their devices just for a period of time so that they can collect data about how does this impact your sleep, your relationships, your free time, what's it like? You just have to gather data. And then once we have that information of how it changes your daily experience, then you can make choices to use social media in a more strategic way, a way that actually the benefits of it, right? Connecting to other people and marketing whatever it is you're trying to market. I have an Instagram account for my consulting practice. I built it starting last August, I think is when I launched it, purely as a marketing tactic for this book, because that's what we do now. Social media is the print marketing of 25 years ago. Now you have to have a social media platform. And it's been very helpful to use it as it's part of my job. So when I'm working, a little portion of my day, 5 days a week, is interacting with my Instagram. Then when I'm not doing that for my job, I know I'm just doing it to distract myself, hurt myself, or avoid something. It's very clear to me because it's part of my job. And I eliminated all private social media in my life. I have found that very helpful. And I have other clients who have been very avoidant of sort of social media and internet, and I actually have to have them come into it a little bit more and approach it with a willingness to see how can this serve you? How can it serve your art? Sometimes people have a hard time thinking about doing something for themselves. So I'll say, well, think about being of service to your practice, service to your art, service to this project you love. What would you be willing to do to support this project? Sometimes people can amp up their willingness a little bit when it's about the work and not themselves.
And the other half of that advice was go out and talk to people face to face.
Yeah, just be in community with people, just be with human beings, because isolation is so common among artists. Not all modalities, but a lot of forms that artists and writers work in, necessarily they have to be alone in their heads for periods of time, or with materials, or with ideas, with research. And it's important to come back out of that and be with other people, because the artist's brain does many brilliant things and comes up with lots of incredible work, but it does not reflect the artist accurately back at themselves. So it's like the brain helps the artist make all of this incredible work and then tells them, this is all shit and you're gonna die alone, which is not true. And so being with other people and having yourself reflected back at you accurately helps counter the sort of crazy thoughts that are always spinning in the human head.
Yeah, you talk about that in the book when you lived with a bunch of writers in San Francisco a while back, right?
The artist retreat that I used to run. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, spooky writer face. I used to run this queer artist retreat in the Yucatan through San Francisco literary nonprofit called Radar Productions. And the very first year, I was the administrator. So I sort of managed the whole thing. I did all the shopping and the cooking and picking people up from the airport. And the very first year I noticed we had set hours during which artists had to have quiet working time, right? Because we were in close quarters together. And when those hours were over, everyone would descend with like haunted looks on their faces, like they had never seen humans before. And they would sort of like fumble around the kitchen asking me how to make boiling water. And I was like, what has happened to everybody? And then I realized they were coming out of this zone of making their work, and sort of there's this transition period between being deep in the work and coming back into reality that my collaborators and I called spooky writer face. And whenever I've seen it in artists many, many times. I remember one time seeing Justin Vivian Bond perform here in San Francisco, probably like 5 or 6 years ago. And at the end of the show, they had some like show-stopping song at the end that was so grand, and their whole body was in the performance. I remember watching them at the end of the song, and they sort of came awake and like saw the people around them like for the first time. I was like, oh my God, that spooky writer face. They were just in that zone where we didn't even exist, and then they came to again, like they were in a trance. It was wild to watch.
So I'm going to ask one last question, and then we're going to throw it to the audience. So please get your questions together. Is someone going to moderate? Is people help? Yeah? Okay. So one of the things that I found really spoke to me in your book was you said the compulsion inside of you that drives you to make things is a gift.
Hey, Tammy.
Yes. Sure. Is this better? All right. The compulsion inside of you that drives you to make things is a gift, not a universal one. This gift must be of service first and foremost to you, and then other people.
I have no memory of writing that. I believe I did.
It's, I have to say, for me, it's hard to think of what I do as a gift to myself. It took me several years before I could, claim and name that I'm a dancer, let alone a belly dancer, with all of the stereotypes.
Right.
And then to say, okay, yes, this is a gift to myself. This is part of my self-care. It took years to get there, and I'm still working on it, quite honestly.
Yeah.
And so I guess I want to hear some stories about artists that you know who have made that leap, or who are successful in making that leap. That you see them really invigorated and engaged in their art, and you can see that it's a gift to themselves before it's a gift to others.
I think I see it in artists when they invest the resources their work deserves and needs, when they are actually willing to do the things that they feel sort of like, surely I couldn't do that. I couldn't spend that money or take that time, or I couldn't invest in my creative process in that way. That would be selfish, or whatever socialization is telling them they shouldn't do it. And when I see them actually direct the resources that they need to and want to toward their projects, I think that's when I see that come into fruition. And what happens is, not only the work gets stronger, but the artist feels more like an artist. So it's sort of like when you treat yourself more like an artist or a writer, you take your work more seriously. One of the great things about watching writers at that retreat I used to run is a lot of them, this was their first experience of any kind of artist retreat. And I remember people saying, I've never been treated like a writer before, that was my purpose, because I would serve them dinner, and they couldn't believe I'd made them dinner. And I was like, yeah, because your job for these 10 days is you're just here to write and commune with these other writers. And people couldn't believe it, But it was transformative because then they took themselves more seriously and the work more seriously. Because I always think, take the work seriously, don't take yourself too seriously. But when they realized that their work was deserving of this time away and deserving of these hours and muddying through hard feelings and difficult portions of the work and being with people that maybe intimidated them, the work got stronger and they took themselves as an artist more seriously, and they're willing to name it. I think a lot of my clients are socialized in lots of different ways, and all of these socializations interact with the problem of being an artist in a culture that really devalues art and art as labor, art as a job. And so a lot of people have a hard time sort of even naming that for themselves. Like, tell you the number of people I've met in Los Angeles, artists who will come see me, that they'll say, well, I have a hard time saying I'm an artist. And I'm like, look at your CV and your student loans from CalArts. I think you're an artist. I mean, you went to all of this trouble to make work and invest this time and money into your practice. I think you can go ahead and say it. Are you making things? Boom, there you go.
All right. So let's hear from some folks in the audience. So
we'll do it like this. We'll have folks raise their hands if you have a question. We'll get a queue going. I'll have you just stand where you are and say your question. And then Tammy, if you can repeat it into the microphone so we're sure everyone hears it.
Sure.
I actually want to throw out the first one. So actually, from following your work and your philosophy approach recently has made me sort of get more into figuring out what it is I'm doing in the arts. And the other thing is having a kid, because I realized I don't want my child to grow up never seeing me do anything and make anything. I want my kid to see me having a full life,
right.
The full life that I actually want to have. Which is why it's wild to me that you aren't an artist. What happened? Is it nature?
What happened, Beth? Why aren't you an artist?
I'm not wired to be one.
You spent a lot of time studying artists, and I would be interested to hear what is the difference between when someone becomes an artist and when someone becomes you. Beth Pickens.
Me. I'm a puppet master. I'm more of I like power and redistribution of wealth. That's it. If I were in Harry Potter, I'd be in the dark arts of capitalism. That's what I do. In the Big Book of Birthdays, I'm sure there's a lot of queer people here who have read the Big Book of Birthdays. My page in there, January 15th, my job is cult leader. So like my life could have gone a lot of different ways. And you're really happy that it went, I'm obsessed with art and artists, especially weird queer people. But I don't make things. I have no this was not, like, I was tasked with a 20,000 word book that's primarily composed of lists. You'll see this is very much a Capricorn's book. It's a series of lists and homework. I don't I don't have a writing practice. I don't make things. I truly don't identify as an artist. And because I work with so many, I see the through line in what artists are like. I live with one. I'm married to one. She's crazy. I mean, I'm crazy too, but in a very different way. It's just a kind of wiring. And my theory on it, like I said, is that you all who are artists, you have to do that thing. It is really like what keeps you grounded and keeps you going. And I have you have other things too. I have lots of other things. One of them is not making anything. You know, my primary motivation for writing this book, I started a self-help book for artists back in 2015 because I have very limited time in my consulting practice. I very rarely take new clients on. I mostly turn people away. And I felt really bad because I have no colleagues to refer artists to. And if I could work with all of them, I would. And I thought, it'd be great if I like wrote a book and just wrote down everything I do, and then I'd have something to offer an artist that I can't work with. Then I was like, I could do that. I could just like write it all down. And this is a brief written account of what I do with artists. So in lieu of my being able to work with everyone in the world, I can say, just read this book.
Just read the book.
Read the book.
Who's next?
Can we see some hands? Who has a question? Raise your hand. Who would like to be in the queue? 1, 2. We'll get some more. So start right here.
I wanted to ask you if you could discuss rejection, especially repeated rejection.
Yeah.
Discuss rejection, especially repeated
Yeah.
rejection.
Rejection sucks. It feels bad. And the more you get it, the more you get comfortable with it. Most things that you ask for and apply for as an artist, as a writer, you're not going to get, just statistically. But the more you ask for and apply for, statistically, the more stuff you will get. I tell people, for every rejection, every time a client and I are really bummed because they didn't get a grant or they thought they were going to get in some residency or some really great opportunity, I tell them you're allowed to feel like shit for half a day, for one afternoon. Then the next day, you have to do 2 things toward that thing you want. Apply for 2 more things, plant 2 more seeds toward that opportunity that you want. But of course, you have to feel bad. Like, it sucks when you don't get things. When Guggenheim's came out, none of my clients or any of my friends who applied for a Guggenheim, none of them got one. And they all felt bad together. Because most people didn't get it, right? They were all in good company. Lots of brilliant people didn't get one. So I tell people the things that you really, really want, you keep applying for until you get it. And you keep asking for feedback to make sure you are eligible and competitive for that opportunity, no matter what it is. There's like maybe an apocryphal story, I'm not really sure, about Carolee Schneemann in the Guggenheim that I often repeat, and it may not be true. But the story goes that she applied for a Guggenheim 16 times and got it on the 17th. She really wanted that thing. And I tell my clients, the things that you really, really want, it's just in the calendar that every year, every quarter, or whatever, you're applying for that thing. Always refining, making sure you are eligible, you are competitive, asking for any feedback anytime you don't get something. But sometimes the things you don't get, there's a reason too. I really believe that rejection is the universe's protection, and that we get the things when we're supposed to get them. And because we can't zoom out of our lives and we only are in the minutia day to day, it's hard to see how it all sort of fit together in the end. But whenever you're rejected from something, just remember all your smart peers were also rejected.
Thank you. New hands, and here, and then.
Hi there. Thanks so much, y'all, for being here and talking about your stuff. I had a question about, so I'm an activist professionally as well as like in my free time, and a big portion of what I do for my work is writing. And I know a lot of us activists who are lucky enough to also have it as a kind of career, put a lot of our artistic energy towards that work, and then creating work that's like centric to our own identities becomes a bit more lost, or there's not as much energy for it. And I hear you saying you really have to guard that time really preciously. And I'm just wondering if either of you have any tips about kind of how to still create that space when you're already doing your art for a lot of the day.
So the question is how to create your space, more space for the art you want to do.
When your professional life and free time are consumed with creative activism? Is that? Okay.
Yeah, I relate to that because the firm that we're a part of deals with arts and racial justice. And I actually started as a racial justice activist and organizer for many, many years. And so in a lot of ways, this firm is my dream job because it includes the both of them. But it's also not dancing, which is my passion. So about, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago, I made the decision, I got to treat it like my job. Everything about my dancing goes on a calendar because I live by my calendar. If it's not on the calendar, it doesn't exist to me.
Me too.
Right? So studio time, and it's in my budget as well. Right? Because it's not in my budget, it sure as hell's not going to happen. So studio time to write the grants, time to go to my friends' stuff and support them. It's all on the calendar. I have to admit I don't always achieve it, but I put it on the calendar, and when I get to the day, I make that decision. But one day a week is all about my dance, right? And sometimes that gets cut down to a half a day, and rarely it gets cut out altogether. But it's always on the calendar, right? So I think for me, the mental switch was, I got to treat this like I treat other things that are my passion. Like I treat my job, because I'm passionate about getting that paycheck, right? And if it's real, it goes on the calendar. If it's real, I invest real money into it, so it's in the budget, right? If it's real, I give real planning time to thinking about, like, what is it that I need to do this year with my dance? What am I not doing this year with my dance? Maybe I'm not producing a show. Maybe I'm just dancing in other people's show. Maybe I'm not going to be in a show this year, and I'm just going to, like, study my craft, right? And, like, I actually put some serious time away to think about that, just like we have planning retreats for our jobs, right? So, in some ways, even though you know, initially it's like, oh my God, I got to treat my passion like my job. Ooh. Yeah, you do. You do, or it doesn't happen.
Because whatever we feed grows.
Right.
And I agree with everything you said. And what I would add, because it sounds like there's not clear parameters or boundaries around these different parts of your life. So, and I have a lot of clients who have similar experiences. And what I tell them is to take one day, ideally 2 in a row if you can, but one day when you're doing none of those things. One day where you're doing nothing in the world of capitalism at all, a Shabbat, if you will. Have a day, the weekend, what unions fought for, right? Oh, and artists often, they may not be able to find 2 days, certainly maybe not 2 days in a row that they can have away from all of those things. But one day off from all of it makes the rest of the week more efficient and clear, I believe.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you'll find the rest of the world in that one day does not collapse because you weren't working that day.
And nobody forgot you.
Yeah.
Or stopped loving you.
Right. But absolutely, if you start continuously giving up that one day of your art would disappear and you become a monster.
Monsters, all of you.
All right, new hands, any other questions? Let's go ahead, right here.
Hi, Beth, welcome. So my question is, why do we have this tendency to hurt ourselves? And to an extent, while we are longing for something we may never achieve?
I didn't get all of it.
Why do we hurt ourselves and long for things we may never achieve?
Yes.
I think that's just humans. I think that's just the human brain and what people's brains are like. I mean, we hurt ourselves usually because there's something familiar about the pain that we're sort of moving toward. That's what my counseling background would tell me. And so when we do something that hurts us, I would say, ask yourself, what would a contrary action be? What would the opposite of this be, and do that thing? And longing for things that, again, I just think that's sort of like, that's how we're wired. That's just what our brains do. Like, that just might be what we as people, as human animals do.
And maybe it's about reframing. I mean, like, what is it that we think we can't have? Right? Maybe it's because we haven't seen someone else do it. Doesn't mean it can't exist. Right? I mean, if that was the case, then we would never have the first woman of color, you know, as egregious that may be in 2018, right? But maybe you got to be the first.
All right, other hands? We have someone here in the back.
I'm curious about, you kind of spoke to this before, but how do you talk artists through this like process of like a blockage or almost like an imposter syndrome, especially in cases where maybe it seems like the work will just never see the light of day?
How do you talk artists through blockages and imposter syndrome?
Yeah. Most people feel like imposters is the secret. And I think when people know that all the people around them feel the same way, it sort of loosens it up. Like, okay, you can feel like an imposter and do a thing anyway. Blockages, when a client feels really stuck with something, my first instinct is to tell them it's time to bring somebody else in. Because you might be trying to do something perfect, and there's no such thing. I have a lot of clients that will want to hold on to work for a really long time because it's not perfect. And perfection is an illusion that you will never reach, and your brain will never let you believe something is perfect. So when somebody feels blocked, I think the two strategies I go to are, is it time to invite other people in? Like, does somebody need to come in here somehow? Do you need to invite people into the studio? Do you need to have somebody, just some other eyes on it, inviting someone in? And I might ask them, maybe it's done. Maybe it's time to sort of turn over and give to the world. Because sometimes people are stuck in that idea of it's not quite finished, but their brains will never let them believe it's finished. Those are some things that come up for me. We can talk more one-on-one.
Can we get two more hands? We have one here in the very front, and then the next one will be the last question.
Hello. I'm curious, in all of your talking with artists, if you found that people who make like a daily commitment versus a weekly commitment, or how people deal with the calendaring of the time, if there are things that you've noticed work the best.
So is there a trend that she knows, or a pattern of how often people make a commitment?
Yeah.
Daily or weekly or whatever?
Because like calendars for me sort of stress me out. Like I really like to have unscripted time. So putting it in the calendar can kind of give me anxiety. So I'm curious.
Yeah. I think it's really, it depends on the person, and everybody's wired a little differently and may change over time. And so I think it's for sort of identifying with the person, like, how are you wired? What works for you? Trying a few different things and sort of see what works, and that somebody else's solution isn't going to work for another person. And so whatever doesn't work, abandon that and try a different thing. But there's no formula that I know of that's sort of ubiquitous for all artists, or, you know, all artists in particular discipline. Because people are just wired differently, and certainly their lives are set up so differently.
Can we have the very best and final question of the night? Who will it be?
You know what, I would just say thanks a lot for writing the book. You know, and I can't believe when you're talking that there's no one else that you can refer anyone to when they can't see you. So it does seem like something that, you know, artists need this. Artists do need support on multiple levels. So anyway, hopefully there'll be more, or people will be trained through you to do more.
Yeah, I always tell people, you know, if you kind of like this job that I've created for myself and you want to do it, here's what I did. Here's the training I got. Here's sort of how I learned to make this consulting practice. I can refer you 100 people to get you started. Because I can refer people to grant writers, certainly, and fundraising specialists. And I can refer people to career counselors or arts consultants who know about career strategy, but the thing that made me unique and different and special that I didn't even do on purpose was I just put all of the things I knew how to do together under one roof.
I think part of the problem is that, after people go through any kind of, like their MFA or whatever, that it's easy for people to lose connection to the conversations, just even about the practical aspect of what is it like to be an artist in the world practically.
Absolutely. Leaving the structure of school. I have a section in the book that's advice for people in BFA and MFA programs of what to do right before you leave and when you get out. Because being outside of a structure where the whole point of your day is to be in your practice and be in conversation, when that leaves, it's highly typical for a person to feel really sort of lost and at sea. And so again, that's where community is crucial, because small groups of artists can create that for themselves. And it's so needed to counter isolation and remain connected to one's practice.
So I just want to echo even strongly, thank you for writing this book. The questions and the list are so helpful. And I think especially in these times when I think now more than ever artists are needed to interject directly or indirectly, and we're being pushed back away from it. Funding is being cut. We're being pitted against each other. We're being pitted against communities for housing and income. To really think through how do I be in this climate is really important.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this book. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks for all the work you do too.
Thank you.